Okay, thanks for sticking around with us on this beautiful day outside. It's wonderful to see so many people here for this very, very important occasion. My name's Dan Richter. I'm director of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and I've been very proud this year to be able to host the office for the Penn Slavery Project. And this is a project that I've been able to sort of witness from sort of afar for its entire development. And I'm really interested in this opportunity to hear from people who have been much more deeply involved than I have over the past few years. So we have with us today on this session called Working on the Penn Slavery Project, Current Research Areas, Strategies, and Ideas for the Future. We have, in alphabetical order, Ariel Julia Brown, raise your hand so people know who you are, who serves both as the cultural planning consultant to the Penn Slavery Project and the public programs developer at the Penn Museum. Ariel's a cultural producer, a dramaturge, and artist. She got an MA in Public Humanities while serving from 2015 to 2017 at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice as a graduate fellow at Brown University. Next, VanJessica Gladney, Public History Fellow at the Penn Slavery Project. She's worked with the project since its first semester. As an undergraduate, she studied the 18th century trustees and faculty members who held enslaved people and the connections between slavery and Penn's original and current campuses. She's currently the Provost Public History Fellow and proud to say will be beginning her PhD work at Penn here in the fall in the history department. So. As will our next presenter, Breanna Moore, who is also going to be entering the PhD program in Penn this fall. She's a 2015 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with majors in international relations and African studies, and she worked on the Penn Slavery Project in the spring of 2018. And I should just take this opportunity to say how wonderful it is to see people coming out of this program inspired to pursue their PhDs and for further graduate work and to bring those great skills to our Penn History Department over the next few years. Next, we have Paul Mitchell, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Penn. He's worked with the Penn Museum's physical anthropology section and most intently with the Samuel George Morton Cranial Collection, which is grim work indeed, I'm sure. And we're very fortunate to have him with us this afternoon. He's working on a dissertation on craniology in the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands and France in the early 19th century, and he's co-curating an upcoming exhibit at the Mutter Museum on a cranial collection there. And finally, Alexis Broderick Newman, who's the Provost Postdoctoral Fellow for the Penn Slavery Project and the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. She has just completed her PhD in the History Department at Penn. And a wonderful project called American Incest, Kinship, Sex, and Commerce in Slavery and Reconstruction. So I'm going to call on people roughly in the order, as I understand it, of their involvement with the project, and ask them each to begin by just telling us how they got involved with this project and what the experience has meant to them. So we begin with the present at the creation, that's VanJessica Gladney. So if you could just tell us a little bit about how you got involved and what it's meant to you.
So when I was a junior as an undergraduate, I took a course with Professor Kathy Brown called Deciphering America. And during that semester, other Ivy League universities were thinking about renaming dorms and renaming statues or monuments because of their complicity with slavery. And I honestly didn't know how I felt about that because it's important to pay tribute to different historical figures, but we should also keep in mind that a lot of these figures are problematic, but do we want to take the statues down because we should talk about them as holistic people? So I did what we learned to do in early school years, and when I didn't know what to do, I asked my teacher. And I asked Professor Brown what she thought about that, and she informed me that, well, Penn needs to start asking those questions as well. She sent out a message asking for students who were interested in being involved in the Penn Slavery Project, and even though I was not a history major, I sent her an email back saying I was interested. And I did not know that it was going to be this big, honestly. We started out as 5 undergraduate students meeting on Friday mornings with donuts and coffee that she had to bribe us because it was early in the morning. And I didn't know that it was going to gain such traction and momentum and support. So I'm really glad that I was on from the beginning. and started as an undergraduate and got to participate in the research, and then as a fellow got to see how the public was really interested and how we can take this project and shift it into the public sphere, because it's not just about Penn, it's about the greater Philadelphia community. And yeah, so that's why I have stayed involved.
Okay, great. Alexis, I think you're probably the next one in line in terms of seniority in this project. So.
Yeah, so thanks, Dan. Thanks for that introduction. And I will just echo that it's wonderful to see so many people and so much interest and so much community participation. This is, it's wonderful given all of the work that's been done since VanJessica and that group of 5 students and Kathy were discussing this over coffee and donuts, and it's really come a long way. So I became involved in March of 2018. I was hired by the Provost as part of the initial working group that was convened. At that point, the project was really in its, I think, embryonic stages where there were different tracks and people looking at it from different directions. The administration was figuring out what their involvement was going to be with the student group. And I was really excited to then be appointed as the postdoctoral fellow for the project and have the opportunity to act as a co-instructor of the undergraduate research seminar. So what started off as kind of a multi-pronged, like the provost is looking at it, the students are looking at it, it really coalesced into a unified investigation. And I think the work really benefited from that, and you can see in the student research. And yeah, now I've been working really closely with continuing working with the students and with the libraries on this exciting augmented reality project that we're going to reveal later soon.
Great, thanks. Breanna.
Yes. So I had found out maybe towards the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, that my 4th grade grandmother and 3rd grade grandparents were actually enslaved by a Penn alum, and that I would pass the plantation, which they were enslaved on in my hometown, like every Sunday going to church to my grandmother's house. And so when I first saw that the Penn Slavery Project had launched in fall of 2017, I reached out to Dr. Brown, who I had had a relationship with as an undergraduate, and just shared with her the information. And she shared the information with the students, and that's when I was actually invited to attend a few of the meetings, and I was asked if I wanted to join and present. So that's really how I became a part of the project.
Now I've lost track of my cue. I guess Ariel, you're probably next.
Indeed. I joined this project. I'll go back a little bit further and say that in my graduate work at Brown, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice hosts one fellow per year that is committed to looking at how cultural institutions can be held accountable to interpreting histories around slavery. So through that fellowship, I learned how to do that on Brown's campus. I learned about what their process had been and how it exists and how it's evolving. I started working at the museum in January of last year, and when I heard about the project, I reached out to Kathy and said, hey, I want to support students however possible. My work is around cultural strategies and how can I be present and support that work. And Kathy was like, I think you'd be more useful to the provost, but come be present with us. And so Alexis and I think, started around the same time. And I was looking at benchmarking around 8 different comparable universities and the investments that they have made, the infrastructures that they have around looking at their histories related to slavery, and the cultural offerings they have built out over time. So yeah.
And Paul.
So I suppose I'm the latest addition. I am a graduate student, a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology. And I've worked very heavily for over 5 years in the physical anthropology section of the Penn Museum, working with curator Janet Monge, who is here in the audience today, working on the large collections of human remains that are in the museum, I will note that the Penn Museum is an institution founded at the very end of the 19th century, and for this reason, those human remains collections that are in the museum are really there as after having been previously at the Penn Medical School or the Horner Wistar Museum or at the Academy of Natural Sciences, but they're currently curated at the Penn Museum today. Having worked intensively with those, Janet and I were approached by Professor Brown to try to determine concretely the provenience of human remains that may have been connected to enslaved individuals or the slave trade. Thus far, it's been clear that in the Samuel George Morton collection, as was discussed earlier today, there are at least 55 individuals that almost certainly were enslaved in their lifetimes. Their crania are currently in the Morton collection. Two of those crania never actually were transferred from the Academy of Natural Sciences, where the collection was held in the 19th century, when that collection was moved to the Penn Museum in 1966. But certainly we know that the Morton collection does have the remains of enslaved people in it, and we also suspect that there may be the remains of some enslaved people in the Horner Wistar collection, which is also currently curated at the Penn Museum. So I've been fortunate to work with a number of undergraduates trying to precisely trace these connections, and this has led us then to sort of ancillary questions about the donors of these remains and the histories of those individuals whose remains are currently at the Penn Museum.
Paul, could you just say a little bit more about some of those issues at this point, if you can?
Issues, oh, there are many issues.
Yeah.
So to begin with, to set some context on Morton, and it was already discussed in many ways that Morton was a foundational thinker in establishing ideas of distinct racial difference in human populations. He did not develop the racial taxonomy that became influential throughout the 19th century. That traces really to European thinkers, but Morton provided data to bolster an argument for innate human differences, largely on the basis of brain size. And the reason that Morton collected crania, as opposed to any other body part, was that he was interested to measure the inside of the skull as a way to measure brain size, and thereby to rank the differential intellectual capacity of the 5 races that he recognized. It's well known through a series of publications and a series of debates about those publications, the most important publication, or at least influential, being that of Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, that Morton achieved results that very much were in line with his racial biases, concluding that Caucasians, especially in his words, the Teutonic or the Germanic branch of the Caucasians, had the largest cranial capacity of any human group, and that various other races or groups fell in descending order underneath them, with what he called the Negro group being at the bottom, what he called the lowest grade of humanity. Morton was not very explicit in his pronouncements about slavery. Looking at his correspondence, however, as opposed to just his published work, becomes quite clear that he was very much invested in refuting arguments that were made by other anthropologists in the earlier part of the 19th century that actually attempted to forward human equality on the basis of anatomical measurement. Irrespective of his motives, his work was absolutely taken as foundational for providing an empirical basis for racial difference. And that legacy has in many ways stuck with the collection ever since. I will note, however, that both the American Civil War and Darwin's Origin of Species, published 1 year before the beginning of the American Civil War, very much made Morton a defunct figure in sort of the American intellectual pantheon, but he was very much honored at the time of his death, and in the decade or so following his death in 1851. So the final thing that I'll add here is just to say that we do suffer from a lack of sources that can bring us to concrete conclusions in many cases about those individuals whose remains are in Morton's collection or in the Horner and Wistar collection, simply because it was very, because the provenience of these individuals was not remarked upon by the collectors, and it's not always certain that those individuals classified as Negro, for example, by Morton, were or were not enslaved. He was frequently more interested in looking at racial difference, actually exclusively really interested in looking at racial difference, the conditions of life whether this person was enslaved or not, were of relatively less importance to him. So there are more remains of African descendant people in the Morton collection and in the Horner Wistar collection that may derive from enslaved people. We just can't say for sure because the record in many cases is quite spotty.
Yeah, and certainly the fact that names and biographical details aren't attached to these remains is a real marker of the kind of intellectual work that was done. This is categorizing people as not as individuals, but as objects. So one of the things that has really struck me about how this project has developed, and this came up, I think, towards the end of the last session, where Professor Brown was talking about how, in many ways, Penn's experience with these issues is both comparable and different than the stories we tell about Brown and Georgetown and other universities. And so I suspect that much of this work began by rightly trying to trace issues of trustees who owned enslaved people, what enslaved people did to literally build the university, and those kinds of issues, which are vitally, vitally important, and for a lot of people, even personally important. We heard Breanna's own family story about this. And so I hope that remains at the center of what we're discussing. But what's really struck me is how this project has evolved to talk about things that aren't just distinctive about, or aren't just characteristic of any old institution with roots in the 17th and 18th century. And any old institution is going to be built in one way or another on the work of enslaved people, and is going to be deeply involved in the economic profits that come from slavery. But I think one of the things that's most distinctive about this work, or most notable at least about this work, is that we're really uncovering how the university as a university, doing what a university does, is so deeply implicated in these issues. The university is all about knowledge, science, investigations, right? And what we've discovered is that Penn as a university, not just as an institution, but as a university, is so deeply involved with the construction of so-called scientific racism, with the justifications of slavery and all this. So I'm interested in throwing this open to the panel as a whole and hoping we really get the conversation going. How it is that the project took that turn to focus on the university as a university, not just as an old institution, and what you think that means for this work going forward.
Yeah, I can start on that. I think for me, from the beginning of my involvement, which was after the students had started investigating the early trustees, I thought that the intellectual story was a huge part of the story. And when I started looking at the intellectual story, meaning the knowledge production, when I started looking at the medical school and looking at where the students were from, and it should be said, I think it's probably become clear from a lot of the student presentations so far, but in this period, in its early first 2 centuries of Penn's existence, it really was its medical school. The college was tiny by comparison. We're talking, a couple dozen students enrolled in the college and hundreds in the medical school. And when I started looking at where the medical students were from, and they are listed by state, there were many years twice as many students coming from Virginia as from Pennsylvania. And I was like, why is that? And part of the answer has to do with William Horner, who was the longtime dean of the medical school, who himself was a Virginian. But I think the question of knowledge production and race pseudoscience, as we would now recognize it, has so much to do with the Southern connection. Penn is the closest medical school to the South. That's part of the reason why so many Southerners are coming to Penn for medical training, and the collection of specimens that was amassed here, as the students discussed, drew a lot of people. So yeah, I think that's a beginning of how I started grappling with that aspect of it.
Yeah, and there's I think what's really interesting is there are a lot of financial institutions and institutions in the country that were built upon and benefited from and contributed to the institution of slavery. But universities are different because a university isn't like a bank or like a manor. It's something that accepts money and then produces people that know things thanks to that money. So if the university is benefiting from the bodies or work or labor or insert verb here of enslaved people, then there has to be some cyclical nature to that. And it was really great that Alexis joined the project because it really opened up the scope of the project from just looking at the people who helped build the university to the people who helped benefit from the university, to the people who perpetuated the knowledge certified by the university. We really started looking at studying the studies of what our university taught, taking what could have just been a purely financial exploration of a university and moving it to a more pedagogical exploration of the university. And I think it really increased the value of the project and made it important to people who both pay for and attend the university.
And I'll say just one more thing on that. I think a slide that Carson showed in her presentation of the quote from Alexander Stevens' Cornerstone speech. And as she said, he was the vice president of the Confederacy, and he is using language about race and about racial difference and the subordination of people of African descent that he is getting from knowledge produced by Penn Medical School. And for me, Carson connected that in a way that more explicitly than I had done to that point. And I think it's one of the best slides I've seen. I mean, I think just the way that's one of the most famous speeches in pro-slavery ideology. If you study the Civil War, you read that speech, and the part that people read, the line that people quote, is based on knowledge produced about race at Penn. So, yeah, the students really just kind of furthered all of these questions and made connections that I hadn't to that point.
So Ariel, as your formal role in this project, among other things, is to be comparative and look at benchmarking other institutions. Do you have any comments on how what's happening here in the Penn and Slavery Project might redound to other places and other?
How this project is in conversation with other places. Yeah, so I think that was kind of the initial, I think the inverse of that question was the initial prompt. It's like, what is everyone else doing? Where do we fall in the landscape of, in relationship to how we are complicit? And where do we fall in the landscape in terms of investment, investment of time, investment of resources, and in my kind of work around that, it was looking at both how universities are working to engage community outside of the university community, but also how they are committed to investing in the infrastructure of these projects so that they have some longevity. I think I'm struggling with this question, to be honest. How is the question, how does this project compare to other projects currently?
Well, do you think that, let's say, Brown and Georgetown have something to learn from the turn that the project has taken here?
I love that question. I think that I think that what I learned over the course of benchmarking and to kind of name the other institutions I was looking at UNC Chapel Hill, University of Virginia, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, Rutgers, New Brunswick, Brown, of course. And each of these universities kind of is uniquely positioned to think about the resources that they have on campus and do a sort of assessment of what resources and cultural centers and spaces on and off campus they have access to, and how to kind of amplify those. And I feel like this project has really brilliantly done this, especially in the partnership with the Libraries and Monument Lab, in the augmented reality project you're going to see soon. But I think that when I heard from each of these projects, transparently, I think all of the lead faculty talked about their struggles with community engagement and talked about their struggles with how to build connections with, frankly, local Black communities. And I think that we are also yet in process with that. Yeah, those are some thoughts around that.
I would say also that, I mean, this is a very young project. Penn admittedly was really late to the game, and some of the, an earlier question addressed that, and we know that there was a narrative about Penn's history with slavery that was publicized for a long time that was not true. Right. So we did have some catching up to do, which involved some undoing and disassembling of the popular narrative. I will say, though, once the students started doing this work, and the work is undeniable, the administration really got behind the project very quickly. And so now I think we're moving at a really fast pace, and I think what the project has been able to accomplish in really a year since we've been, I don't know if we've been formally incorporated. It's still really small compared to something like the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown. I mean, they have a building.
We have an office.
We have an office. That's true. Thanks to Dan. We have a really large, nice office, 2 huge windows. But I do think that if there's something, the technology and the engagement with the library is really something Penn and the Penn and Slavery Project is doing that we know from Ariel's really extensive benchmarking research no one else has done before. Right. So I think that is where potentially other schools can learn from Penn, and we're excited to be able to share that with other schools, to spread that knowledge. But I think it really comes from not only the administration's embrace of the project, but the library's embrace of the project really early on, as Will Knoll said last night. And the libraries means the special collections and the items that are on display in the Lee Library, but it really also means the digital scholarship department headed by Kim Eke and Lori Allen, Megan Moody. We've been working with a lot of people there. So I think it shows how dynamic a project can be when it's open and interdisciplinary, and not looking at the library as just a place where we do the research, but as partners in a collaborative effort, and working with the museum as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I think one thing I wanted to really say is that what's I find really remarkable about this project is that, kind of to go off of your point, at Brown, President Ruth J. Simmons initiated the project herself. That is not the history of this project. That this was work initiated by students, initiated by Kathy Brown, and that the emergence and that kind of like faculty and student-led research and initiative has kind of created a really collaborative project in ways that other universities don't have. There are some universities that there are some lead faculty who are in on what's happening, but it's really administration-led exclusively, and that's not the dynamics of this project at all.
And continuing to speak to the collaborative nature of the project, I think the collaboration across different departments and majors really kind of undercut our tendency to hold on to this idea that slavery existed in a vacuum. Like, if the study of slavery cannot exist in a vacuum within one university, then it's impossible to conclude that slavery existed in a vacuum within our country. It really just kind of speaks to the way that we're studying slavery in the Penn Slavery Project, just speaks to the way that, like, the nation should start handling this. And maybe I'm just saying that because, like, I'm a big fan of the project. I'm here for a year. But it's really great to see that people building from the ground up helping our university, because that's the legacy we like talk about in America, right? The ground up. Well, like the Penn Slavery Project's kind of doing that, so yeah.
Yeah, I think the collaboration really is amazing, in that it does come from the undergraduate students, but also just looking at this panel, the different backgrounds you're all coming from, how you got involved is really a remarkable testament to something special going on here. One of our topics is supposed to be ideas for the future. So I want to kind of shift to that, and I think we could do it in two ways, and I'm going to try to do both those ways. First is to speak sort of individually, particularly to Breanna and VanJessica, about how your ideas for the future as a scholar and as a potential history PhD have been shaped by this experience, and then throw it open to everybody else, to all of you, to talk more about where you think the project needs to go next, where it needs to go for the community and other things. So can I embarrass Breanna by calling on her first to talk about that?
Not embarrassing. I'm particularly interested in studying or drawing a connection between trustees, students, faculty, and their children who are admitted to present day as far as legacy admissions. How does that play into Penn's current student population? If you look at Brown as a model, I think, or as a measure, a ruler stick, the least we could do is have a center to study slavery. I think that would be a great commitment by the university to say we're dedicated to doing this long term. This isn't something that, because it's in the light right now, we're focusing on and we're going to be done with it, say, when it gets out of the spotlight. Also, it would be great to have a student forum of universities studying slavery, which is the organization of all the universities in America right now, even international universities who are looking into their past. Because as VanJessica was saying, since this is student-led, it came from the ground up, students have to keep being the one who is pushing this to make sure that reparatory justice does get served.
Yeah, we are actually, the University Studying Slavery Point is great because I actually went to their conference my senior year instead of going to the spring fling. I went to the study. Yeah, we all went. Went to the conference where the universities were studying slavery and talked to a lot of other universities. So we should definitely start teaming up with. We are in conversation with someone from Drexel. We're talking about reaching across the universities in our area. I think a lot of the student research that's going on, the new research, is really important. The two students who were here, they were talking about the different conversations that students were having, because much like now, the student conversations are leading to changes in the faculty. It stands to reason that that was probably happening back in the day. Also, I know that I want to focus on making the information about this project more public-facing, which is why we made a website, which I made. It's pennandslavery.org. That's PENNANDSLAVERY.org. So please go to it, because pennandslaveryproject.org. I spent a lot of time on it, so please go. But it's things like this where we invite people from the community to hear us talk about this, because all of us talking in a room with each other doesn't really make that much of a difference. So thank you for being here and making a difference and going to the website after you leave.
So I do want to open it up to the room in just a minute, but other ideas about where we should be going next?
I think that this is going to organically come. This is going to be emergent, especially in conversation with this augmented reality work. But, Philadelphia is unique in that it is a city full of folks who engage public history, people who work in the sector of public history, Black folks who work in the sector of public history, and that there's folks who have been doing this work for some time, and there's so many opportunities to kind of engage in a porous dialectic about how to share and exchange this work. So I think that those are futures. And I think that something that I, at times in conversation with the students am talking about is, how are the futures of your research? Like, how are you thinking about the futures of your research outside of frames that are exclusively for academia? And I think that this work that you're going to see soon is going to speak to that too.
I would just, to echo what Breanna was saying, it's really exciting right now. Like, this is our first symposium. Everyone's here. It's a new project, but to maintain the drive forward and the drive to continue the work past that point, past where we have this, and we'll have a bigger launch for the augmented reality project in the fall. But I think we don't want this to fizzle out and Penn and the community be able to say, like, all right, check, we did that. We had this, a lot of people came to the symposium, that was great. And I think part of how we can ensure that is building on what Ariel just said, community engagement, working and being in dialogue with the Black community in Philly, with other schools in the area, like VanJessica was saying, that can't be ignored. So if we all stay engaged and if we do the work of, reaching out to groups in the city and to people in the city who are interested, I think that'll go a long way towards that. And I mean, like Breanna said, having a center would be great. That would, why not?
Is the provost here?
Okay. Well, let's open it up to the audience now for questions and comments. Yes, sir. Do we have a microphone?
Yeah, I had a mic last time, so maybe I'm loud enough. My name is Abdul Ali Muhammad, and I co-founded a cooperative in Philly called the Black and Brown Workers Co-op. So one, I want to honor all the folks and all the work that went into this project. I'm from West Philadelphia, grew up not too far from Penn. And so I want to kind of color this conversation a little bit by saying that in terms of reparative, somebody mentioned reparative something earlier. I know reparations, but somebody said something else, another language.
I think reparative.
Reparative justice, but I know what reparations is. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And as someone who went to Philly schools, so my middle school, Shaw Middle School, which is now the charter school, a lot of Penn students came there because we had like a program specifically around like Wharton School, so there was a lot of Wharton students there talking about businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know that legacy and the history of Penn kind of embedding itself in students and communities of color, especially Black communities. And so I want to talk a little bit about like the context that we live in, right? Which is that Penn is encroaching upon West Philly even more, that they're trying to expand this idea of University City, and that Black and brown students are disproportionately without access to all the things that you guys talk about in terms of the resources of Penn. So in terms of reparations and reparative justice, I think that Penn needs to look at pilots, which is payments in lieu of taxes, and that the money raised or the money given or whatever to this project needs to go back to Black communities, specifically Black schools and Black students. So that's one of the things, is that someone who never graduated college and I went to like one semester at CCP, I want to challenge all of y'all around this notion of engagement, because a lot of the language is like, oh, this is super diverse as a panel, but all of y'all are academics, all of y'all have access to Penn, right? And what would it look like? What would the work look like if you actually invested in Black folks who are native to Philadelphia, right? Who are historians, but not in the traditional kind of framework of what a historian or academician is, number one. Center those voices, because there's a lot of history in this room.
That's right.
So that's one thing. And another thing is like, how about bringing in students into that process, Black students especially, and giving them this and giving them space to kind of help grow this project. And so that's my two things. And because you can't talk about all this work in a vacuum, right? When people are constantly being displaced in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is one of the most gentrified cities. And so this has to be connected to the displacement of Black folk in Philadelphia and having that conversation. Also, what are you like? Well, how is this interacting with that? Yeah, my 2 cents.
So one of the ways that I have tried to address some of those things is as the public history fellow, I've taken a lot of the information that we have off of campus. I did a presentation with Uhuru in West Philly. We went to a book fair. I've gone to some different churches throughout the city and it's a very interesting dynamic to go to a place where you kind of feel like you are intruding, because even though you are a person of color, you do carry this academic, like, heavy, historically white institution banner, and then you come in and say, like, I have things to say. So trying to turn presentations and announcements into a dialogue is one of the things that we've tried to do this year. I don't really know how to speak to the gentrification. I just do know that I call it pentrification, just as a thing. But it's a complicated line to walk, because you reside in a city and then bar that city from entering that space. And as a person of color, I struggle with that. As someone who graduated from this university and plans to attend, and I'm very proud to go to this university, but still struggle with our past and struggle with our future, I think I'm not really answering this question, so if someone else wants to take it, then that's fine. But that tension, I share it. You're not alone in that tension. And I didn't grow up in Philly, so I don't know your pain as much as, like, I want to. But that struggle of trying to put your own history into a place where history should exist, but your history doesn't inherently, quote unquote, belong, that is something that I think participation in this project has really helped me deal with. And I know that, like, you can't just say, like, we do have Black people, but there are students of color who are part of this project. Just none of them, everyone decided to not be here or get a job interview with a fancy company. So we are doing we are trying to do the work to reach out to people of color in Philadelphia and students of color within Penn. So you have been heard. I don't know if that makes you feel any better, but you are heard.
Then I would just say that I was born and raised in South Carolina, but my father, his parents were born and raised here in Philadelphia. My dad was actually the second graduating class of University City High, which, has been torn down. And cousins that went to Bartram, and speaking with them when I first moved to Philly, they didn't even know Penn was an Ivy League school, or that was something that was accessible to them growing up here in Philadelphia. So I definitely feel what you're saying. I think we both know that living in the West, like under capitalism, that the university, any university, it should serve the community, but it doesn't always do that. Ideally, the university would be open to, everybody who lives there be able to come to the university and get knowledge to better themselves, but, like, we know what the reality is and what it isn't. I think it's important to have these conversations of repertory justice with the community, because if we don't, somebody else is going to tell us what repertory justice is, and we don't want their opinions of what they think it should be. So even for Georgetown, saying that, okay, for our repertory justice, we're going to admit students of color who are descendants of slaves into the university. But it's like, who said that's what we want? Who says we want to get your education? So I definitely feel what you're saying, and I think that's something we should continue to work on. Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to, say that in kind of the initial benchmarking work that I also kind of sat with folks in community, who brought up, however, not as succinct and on point as your analysis was, like all of your points, right? And that those points were frankly presented in Alexis and I submitted reports to working group. And so some of those concerns have been shared. But I also want to say that in the spirit of saying and talking about this as a collaborative project, that I know any one of these folks, including myself, would be interested in talking about what kind of, what a forum space could look like to be able to continue and extend that conversation. So yeah, thank you.
Yes.
My question is pretty short. I was wondering if you have, and maybe this was mentioned in the first presentation. Maybe this was something that came up when the undergraduates presented, but I was wondering if you have any working relationship with the medical school, and if you don't, if that's something that you would like, and how you might envision your findings being incorporated into maybe the Penn medical curriculum.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Dorothy Roberts, and my program on race, science, and society, which is co-sponsoring this session, is working with the students, but also with the medical school. So I've already established a relationship with Dr. Eve Higginbotham, who is the Vice Dean for Inclusion and Diversity at the medical school. They are funding a summer medical student research fellowship for to work on this project with me and the broader project. And I have is Azel here? There he is. This is going to be our Azel Sanford will be our new postdoctoral fellow in the program on race, science, and society to work specifically on this question of addressing the legacy of Penn Medical School's entanglement with slavery in the current medical practices, training, and research that goes on at Penn Medical School, but also in medical schools around the country. So that is exactly what we're trying to do and exactly the connections that I've been making already and plan to continue making. Even just, I don't know if I can call out Dr. Julie Fairman. We were just talking during the break about the coffee break, about including the nursing school as well. Although that wasn't part of Dr. Gutman's statement, but we can draw these connections as well. So that's precisely the vision that we have for moving this part of the project forward to address the way in which these atrocious ideas that really were started and promoted in Penn medical education continue to shape and harm medical practice and patients of color today. Thanks for the question.
In the back? Yes.
I guess the only, Richard, I'm a tour guide here in Philadelphia, dealing with the African American experience from 1776 to 1876, so if this Penn experience fits into that. My concern is around the knowledge production. That's what I was trying to drive to be earlier, and I'm glad I'm hearing you raise that, because now I'm wondering, how does the project look at the political economy? Because if the medical school was a part of producing individuals, was to justify the economic development of the political economy of America, it really is justifying capitalism and the structural relationship that somebody has to be on the bottom. So would slavery, this slavery project deal with that? And the other side, I think I would like to see the project develop into the voices of Africans in reaction to, and that's free Africans and enslaved, in relationship to the knowledge production. Because I think even in Philadelphia were people who were, even though they're seeing Morton and hearing this, they're reacting to it. It's not like the University of Penn is just producing this knowledge and there's no knowledge by Africans who are enslaved and free. So I'd like to see how this moves into that realm.
So I can address your second question, not as a former researcher with the Penn and Slavery Project and not as the public fellow, but as a fellow tour guide in Philadelphia. Hey. And the ways that I'm not sure how, I guess someone else should attack the first question, but this idea of making sure that voices are heard, I think that it's important to try to weave this information that I hope you have learned today and the information I've been learning into your general, like, discussion about history or politics. All of my friends know, my roommate's here, and she can attest to this, that I do often just slide into things about how some of the political problems which we face in this country were based on the Constitution. Certain parts of the Constitution were written to protect and preserve the institution of slavery. But you can't really say that. I mean, I say it on a Tuesday dinner with my friends and family. And I think one of the important parts of centering the voices of African enslaved people and freed Africans in Philadelphia is to weave that into the story of Philadelphia at every opportunity. And I don't know how formally one can address that as an institution, but I think it is the responsibility of institutions, but also as us as citizens of this country to start changing the story of our country by saying that, like, this is like the country in a different way, shifting that lens from the popular story that we've all heard to including different voices that we haven't. But if someone wants to answer the first question, that's political climate. Oh, about
The political economy and
Oh, yeah.
capitalism. I feel like your first part spoke to that a little.
about capitalism and how it's bad. I mean,
I think maybe this is a good way to,
in various areas. Medical is one of them. So we're not talking about individual projection, we're talking about the production of knowledge that people are reacting. And the Africans took that knowledge also and responded. So the knowledge production that the University of Penn produced, you have voices on different voices on both sides. So the center, can provide it. That's, and economics was slavery was about economics in America more than anything, but it was also about justifying capitalism as a means or mode of production.
we're going to refer this answer over to our professor, Kathleen Brown.
I mentioned earlier, I had stated in the other panel for the undergrads, I talked about Richard Allen, that specifically responded to one of the people mentioned. I forget the person's name.
Brooke.
Not Brooke.
Oh, Benjamin Rush.
Benjamin Rush.
Benjamin Rush, and like how that's not included in like the context of this conversation.
So I just, is this on? Is this on? Okay. And we're actually reaching the end of the time, and then I'll turn it back over to Dan. So one of the things that's interesting to me, just in response to your question, is the number of African American abolitionists who, when given the chance, get medical educations. And I think out of proportion to the numbers you should have seen, there were still limited opportunities for African Americans following the end of slavery, but a disproportionate number of people who'd been active, giving speeches, agitating against slavery, decided that that was the best way to serve the needs of the newly freed population and the already freed population. And I don't think that's just an accident. I think it is about the politics of knowledge production. And although what kind of medicine they were going into wasn't necessarily going to bring down capitalism, it was about attending to the bodies of people who had been treated as commodities and who had every last ounce of their vitality extracted to make profit that did end up supporting capitalism. Okay, so it's not storming the barricades and bringing capitalism down directly, but it is attending to the daily pressing needs of people for some medical care that actually is about producing their well-being and some kind of quality of life as opposed to their productivity. And so I'll just add that, but hopefully we can talk about this a little bit later, although not right now because we have another session starting.
and if I could just steal 30 seconds to get, I think this is bringing our conversation full circle in some ways, because as we think about the economics and the political economy of slavery and racism and current issues, and also the way in which the Penn Slavery Project has focused on knowledge production, we need to remind ourselves today that Penn is not just the School of Arts and Sciences, not just the Penn and Slavery Project, not just the medical school, the nursing school, but the Penn is also a major hospital corporation. It's a major healthcare provider. It's a major real estate investor. And all of those things are crucial to the contemporary conversation and something that we hope as people who are trying to produce some ideas we can have some impact on. But it's a very, very complicated issue, as are all of these things historically and in the present. So I want to thank the panel and thank all of you for your participation. Great.